Throughout the prophecies of Daniel and Revelation, we find continual reference to a 1260-year time period. It's couched in symbols in three different ways. It's referred to as a time, times, and half a time in Daniel 7 and verse 25 and in Daniel 12 and verse 7. It is referred to as 42 months in Revelation chapter 11, and we'll look at the specific verse shortly. It's also referred to as 42 months in Revelation chapter 13 and verse 5. Then in Revelation 11 and Revelation 12, this same period of time is referred to as 1,260 days, or 1,260 days. So in every case, the time, times, and half a time, the 42 months, and the 1,260 days, all are referring to the same time prophecy. It's referred to 7 different times. They all refer to the 1,260-year period through the Dark Ages that came down beginning in 538 and extending all the way down to 1798. It was in 538 that the decree that Justinian had made in 533 A.D. actually came into effect. And Justinian in 533 declared that the Roman Catholic Church, or the pontiff or the pope of the Roman Catholic Church, would hold temporal or would hold dominion over all the churches of Christendom. That's when Justinian made the decree in 533, but it could not be carried into effect because there were still two powers, two Germanic tribes, that sought to hold the papacy at bay, and those were the Vandals and the Ostrogoths. Both of those powers were defeated. The Vandals in 534, the Ostrogoths were driven from Rome in 538 and were completely exterminated in 551. But by 538, the papacy, the Roman Catholic Church, had begun dominance, had it been given dominance over all the churches of Christendom. And that continued on well down for over 1,000 years. And of course, by the 10th, 11th, and 12th centuries, the papacy gained incredible authority over the kings of the earth as well. But that power they were given in 538 would continue down to 1798. We read in Daniel chapter 7 and verse 25 about the little horn power. It says, "And he shall speak great words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change times and laws. And they shall be given into his hand until a time and times and the dividing of time." Now that's the first reference to this 1,260-year period. Daniel 12 and verse 7 refers to the same period. "I heard the man clothed in linen which was upon the waters of the river, when he had held up his right hand and his left hand unto heaven, and swear by him that liveth forever, that it shall be for a time, times, and a half. And when he shall have accomplished to scatter the power of the holy people, all these things shall be finished." So here again we find this same 1,260-year period referred to as a time, times, and half a time. This same period is referred to again in Revelation chapter 12 and verse 14, where we read these words, "And to the woman were given 2 wings," this is God's church, 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness, into her place, where she is nourished for a time, and times, and half a time, from the face of the serpent. So there again we have 3.5 times in which the Church of God would be in seclusion throughout the Dark Ages. Now you say, well, Bill, how do you get 1,260 years from 3.5 times? Well, the way we do that is simply this. If you look in Daniel chapter 4, we find the story of Nebuchadnezzar's great fall. And we find in the prophecy that was made concerning Nebuchadnezzar and his bout with insanity, Daniel chapter 4, verse 23 and verse 25 declare that 7 times shall pass over him. So 7 times, for 7 times, Nebuchadnezzar would be a crazy man. In the Encyclopedia Britannica, it discusses the fact that Nebuchadnezzar was crazy for a period of about 7 years. And we also read in a book by a wonderful, wonderful Christian writer and prophet, Ellen G. White, a messenger of the Lord, where she declares in the book Prophets and Kings, page 520, for 7 years Nebuchadnezzar was an astonishment to all his subjects. For 7 years he was humbled before all the world. So we find that a time then represents 1 year. Now, are we saying then that the papacy, the Roman Catholic Church, reigned for 3.5 years? Well, no, we're obviously dealing with prophetic time, because the papacy in June of 541 AD did not stop their control over this earth. It continued on for a period of 1,260 years. If we take a year according to Scripture, we find in the book of Genesis, in the story of the flood, it says that Noah went into the ark the 2nd month and the 17th day of the month. And he continued in the ark until the 17th month, or the 7th month and the 17th day of that 7th month. And we find those things in Genesis chapter 7, verse 11. It says that Noah, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, that's when the rain began. And verse 24 of Genesis chapter 7 declares the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. And Genesis chapter 8, verse 4 says the ark rested in the 7th month on the 17th day of the month upon the mountains of Ararat. So from the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month, till the 7th month, the 17th day of the month, that's 5 months. And according to Genesis chapter 7, verse 24, it says the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. Well, we have a 5-month period equaling 150 days. That's 30 days to a Bible month. There are 12 months to a Bible year. Therefore, 12 months times 30 days to a month equals 360 days. We then read that the papacy would rule for 3.5 times, or 3.5 years. Well, therefore, we're going to add 363 times, and then we'll take a half of 360, which would equal 180. And if you add all those together, 360, 360, 360, that's 1,080, plus another 180 would give us 1,260 days. With that in mind, we find in Numbers 14 and verse 34 and Ezekiel chapter 4 and verse 6 that a day in Bible prophecy represents 1 year. So 1,260 days equals 1,260 years. So we find then these prophecies of the time, times, and half a time, all referring to 1,260 years. Now we also read, and I know I went through that very quickly. If you'd like further information on that, write to me and I'll send you the tapes entitled It's About Time, Part 1 and 2, that will go into detail on how to figure out time prophecy. Now we find a few other references to this same 1,260-year period of Roman Catholic Church state control. We find it mentioned in Revelation 11 and verse 3, where the Bible declares, I will give power unto my 2 witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. So we find here that the Old and New Testament, the 2 witnesses, would prophesy 1,260 days in mourning, in hiding, under cover, in caves, in secret, throughout the Dark Ages. So the 1,260 days of Revelation 11 and verse 3 is the same as the time, times, and half a time. We find this referred to again in Revelation 12 and verse 6, where it says, the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared of God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. So once again, 1,260-year period, 538, 1798. Then we find the 42 months of Revelation 11, verse 2, and Revelation 13 and verse 5. But the court which is without the temple, leave it out and measure it not. It is given to the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread under foot 42 months. Well, that 42-month period, 30 days to a month, multiplied together gives you 1,260 days. And of course, we read that very same statement in Revelation 13 and verse 5, where it says, there was given to him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and power was given unto him to continue 42 months. So we find repeatedly, 7 times to be exact, this time period referred to in Scripture of 1,260 years of papal supremacy over the church and the state. Now we know that in 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte sent one of his generals, General Berthier, into Rome. And in that ensuing battle, the papacy, the Pope, was taken into exile, and he died while in captivity. The thing we've got to ask ourselves in this broadcast is simply this. The Catholic Church controlled France. France was the major country in Europe where the Reformation did not take hold, because the French people were constantly, the French reformers were constantly being persecuted by the Catholic Church. So we find then a Catholic country, France, going in and taking the Pope captive. Now that doesn't make any sense at all. But when we understand it in the light of a payback, of revenge, then I think we will. But you know, really this story does not start in 1798. with the deadly wound. The story of 1798 begins before that, roughly about 50 years. I'd like to read to you from a book called The Jesuit Enigma, written by an ex-Jesuit, Boyd Barrett, in 1927. This is page 209 of his book. The Jesuit order had reached the pinnacle of its power and prestige in the early 18th century, the 1700s. It had become more influential and more wealthy than any other organization in the world. It held a position in world affairs that no oath-bound group of men has ever held before or since. Nearly all the kings and sovereigns of Europe had only Jesuits as directors of their consciences, so that the whole of Europe appeared to be governed by Jesuits only. So in the early 1700s, the Jesuit order controlled the world at that time. During this time, however, by 1750, we find that there was something going on in South America, in a place called Paraguay, a very small, insignificant South American country. The Jesuit order for a long time, 50 to 100 years, they had established a system in Paraguay which they called the reductions. Through these reductions, the Jesuit order was making millions and millions of dollars. The Jesuits controlled the people of Paraguay, and they divided them up into small villages, and every single village was answerable to a Jesuit general, a Jesuit leader in those little villages of Paraguay. And all the people would be given enough to eat, they were given a place to live, but goods that they made, the herbs that they produced, the hides, the tallow, the clocks, and other goods that the people of Paraguay manufactured were sent over to Europe to be sold, and the Jesuits were making millions. They were becoming very, very powerful. But finally, after a time, as everything always does, it began to come out that the Jesuits were becoming very, very rich through these reductions. And so the kings of Portugal and Spain and France and Malta, they learned about this plot that the Jesuits were using to make millions of dollars. Finally, in the year 1759, roughly 40 years before 1798, 17 years before the signing of the Declaration of Independence, King Joseph I of Portugal expelled the Jesuit order from his realm. This is Portugal, 1759. Now, granted, Portugal was a Catholic country, but nevertheless, King Joseph was so up in arms and so upset that the Jesuits were not sharing their wealth with him. He was afraid that they were becoming too powerful, that he said, I'm going to suppress them. I'm going to banish them from my realm. And he did in 1759. We read from the book Vatican Assassins by Eric John Phelps on page 291. He quotes from a book called The Complete History of the Jesuit Order, page 583. In order to protect my royal honor, King Joseph I wrote, in order to maintain uninjured my independence as sovereign and ruler, in order to remove from the midst of my dominion such extraordinary and great vexation, And to shield my subjects from similar frightful occurrences, I declare the so-called ecclesiastics, the Jesuits namely, to be thoroughly corrupt, to have receded from the rules of their holy order. I declare them to be notorious rebels, traitors, enemies, and disturbers of the peace, and therefore order that each and every one of them may be looked upon as rebels and traitors. On the strength of this, I declare them to be denaturalized, exiled, outlawed, and banished, and decree that they shall be expelled from all my kingdoms and lordships without ever again at any time being allowed to return. This happened in 1759. 3 years later, in 1762, another Catholic country in Europe banished the Jesuits as well because they were becoming too powerful. And these Catholic emperors in Europe were scared. This time it was the King of France, Louis XV, 1762. We read this from the book by R.W. Thompson entitled Footprints of the Jesuits, page 217 and 218. Whereupon the investigation into the Constitution and statutes of the Society of Jesuits resulted in the enactment of a parliamentary decree which shows the odium then attached to the Society in France. It denounced their doctrines and practices as perverse, destructive of every principle of religion and even of probity, dangerous to the rights of the persons of sovereigns, that the institutions of the Jesuits should forever cease to exist throughout the whole extent of the kingdom. So by 1762, two Catholic sovereigns in Europe had banished the Jesuits because they feared their power and their wealth to dominate and control these Catholic sovereigns of Europe. It didn't take long, but 5 years later, another Catholic sovereign of Spain, this time Charles III, expelled the Jesuits from their realm in 1767. This time we read from the Encyclopedia Britannica, page 341. His greatest work of Charles III, the expulsion of the Jesuits, would never have been carried out if he had not been persuaded of its political necessity. The order had already been driven out by Pombal from Portugal, by Choiseul from France, when Charles III was convinced that a riot in Madrid had been promoted by the Jesuits. And so in 1767, the Catholic Emperor of Spain banished the Jesuits from her dominions. 3 powerful Catholic monarchs on the continent of Europe by 1767 had banished the Jesuits from their realms. 1 year later, on the island of Malta, 1768, Fra Manuel Pinto de Fonseca, the head of the Knights of Malta, declared this: in 1768 the Jesuits, having given much trouble, were expelled and their property confiscated. That happened 1768. With the Jesuits expelled now from South America and from the mightiest Roman Catholic nations on the continent of Europe, Europe's kings demanded that the Pope abolish the Jesuit order. When Pope Clement XIII was about to do this, he was poisoned the night before. We read this in Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson, page 224. This is Clement XIII. He did this in 1769, or he tried to. But the night before, listen to what Thompson says in his book. During the night preceding the day appointed for the public ceremony of announcing the abolition of the Jesuits, Clement XIII was suddenly seized with convulsions and died, leaving the act unperformed and the Jesuits victorious. Corminin records this event in the terse and expressive words, "The Jesuits had poisoned him." And so, it would wait 4 years. In summary, taken from a book by Emmett McLaughlin, an ex-Jesuit, entitled Inquiry into Lincoln's Assassination, pages 84 and 85, we read McLaughlin's words. Even their own Catholic countries finally became surfeited with Jesuit political intrigue and financial avarice, and in self-preservation were forced to expel them. Portugal, Angola, Goa, and Brazil took the lead in 1759. France followed 5 years later. Several Italian states, Parma, Sicily, Naples, followed. Spain threw them out in 1767. This decree suppressed them in the Philippines, Argentina, New Granada, Colombia, Peru, Chile, Ecuador, Guatemala, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Mexico, New Mexico, Arizona. Austria did the same in 1773. And finally, in 1773, Pope Clement XIV abolished the Jesuit order altogether with his document, Dominus ac Redemptor. At this point in the tape, let's turn it over for side 2 of 1798, Payback. Welcome to side 2 of our program entitled 1798, Payback. We notice from side 1 by 1773, 3 years before the signing of the Declaration of Independence, that at least 4 powerful countries in Europe and many others in South America and in the Far East had expelled the Jesuit order from their dominions. Among those were Catholic France, Catholic Spain, Catholic Portugal, and even the papacy itself. Interesting to note that Pope Clement XIV, who issued the decree banishing the Jesuit order, 1773, he made this comment in the book entitled History of Romanism, quoted from Vatican Assassins, page 297, page 604 of the book History of Romanism, where Pope Clement XIV declared, "The suppression is accomplished. I do not repent of it, having only resolved on it after examining and weighing everything, and because I thought it necessary for the Church. If it were not done, I would do it now. But this suppression will be my death." Pope Clement made that statement in July of 1773. 14 months later, Pope Clement XIV was dead. How did it happen? Who would have done such an awful thing? In the Footprints of the Jesuits by R.W. Thompson, page 227 and 228, we read these words. A peasant woman was persuaded by means of a disguise to procure entrance into the Vatican, and offer to the Pope a fig in which poison was concealed. Clement XIV was exceedingly fond of this fruit and ate it without hesitation. The same day the first symptoms of severe illness were observed. He soon became convinced that he was poisoned, and he remarked, "Alas, I knew they would poison me, but I did not expect to die in so slow and cruel a manner." His terrible sufferings continued for several months when he died. "The poor victim," said Cormenin, "of the execrable Jesuits." There were other popes that died in very similar ways. There was Pope Pius XI, who died in 1939, just before he was to deliver an address to the German Catholics that he did not support Hitler. You see, Pope Pius XI had supported Hitler up to that point, but he realized what an awful person he was. And so Pope Pius XI was going to issue a decree to all German Catholics not to follow Hitler. But that was not in the Jesuit scheme. And so Pope Pius XI in 1939 was killed. Another pope, Pope John Paul I, in 1978 was about to expose some awful things that the Jesuit order was doing. And the night before he was going to expose it, he died of poisoning as well. In Avro Manhattan's book entitled Murder in the Vatican, we find the same physical characteristics of all three of these popes were identical. By 1774, one of the Jesuits' nemesises had been poisoned. But still the papacy was determined to keep the Jesuit order banished from Rome. What did the Jesuit order do right after 1773? They've been banished from so many different countries. Their mask has been torn away from their face. And so the Jesuit order began to create a secret society behind which they could carry out all their evil and dastardly deeds. And they would set up, plan, plot, control a new organization that would be their front for what they were wanting to do in the earth. And they would use for the head of that group one of their own men, one who claimed to be an ex-Jesuit, but one who had been trained by the Jesuits from very, very young. Of course, the man's name was Adam Weishaupt. And the organization that the Jesuits founded and controlled was the Illuminati. In the book by Nesta Webster called Secret Societies and Subversive Movements, page 139, we read these words. Weishaupt was not the originator of the system he named Illuminism. It will be ready apparent to every reader of this work. How did these methods penetrate to the Bavarian professor? It was through the Jesuits. The fact that Weishaupt had been brought up by this order had provided the enemies of the Jesuits with the argument that they were the secret inspirers of the Illuminati. Weishaupt did draw to a certain extent on Jesuit methods of training. That's recognized even by Beryl, himself a Jesuit. And of course, the Jesuit general not only had control of the Illuminati, but the Jesuits had control of all the great financial families of Europe. The Rothschilds, the Warburgs, being the two major financial powers of Europe at that time. And so now the Jesuit order would work covertly, behind the scenes, and would use their men, their front men, the Illuminati and Adam Weishaupt, the Rothschilds, and their millions, to seek to regain their own power and then to exalt the papacy to world dominion. Fascinating that the Illuminati was founded May 1, 1776. A little over 2 months after that, there was another group that was formed. There was a document that was signed. It was the unification of 13 little colonies in the Western Hemisphere. The document, the Declaration of Independence. In the work by Bancroft on the history of the United States, pages 119 to 122, we read these words. For more than 2 centuries, Protestant sects had sent up their cry to heaven for freedom to worship God. To the panting for this freedom, half the American states owed their existence. The immense majority of the 13 colonies were Protestant dissenters. The establishment of liberty of conscience, which brought with it liberty of speech and the press, was the fruit not of philosophy, but of the love of Protestantism for the open Bible. Well, what would the Jesuit order do? They had been banished from so many Catholic countries in Europe. They watched, they had their own men, they had their priests going up and down the Mississippi River. Joliet and the other man, I don't recall his name at this moment, Marquette and Joliet. The Jesuits were well planted in the United States. They saw the rise of Protestantism. They saw the rise of the Declaration of Independence. And they wanted to snuff it out. But Catholic France was not with them. Catholic Italy was not with them. Catholic Spain was not with them. Catholic Portugal was not with them. But somehow the Jesuits would want to suppress and destroy Protestantism and republicanism in the 13 colonies. So where would the Jesuits go? Who would they turn to for help at this time of crisis? The only other great power in Europe was England. And it would be through England that the Jesuit order would seek to control and stop the beginnings of another Protestant nation. They would use England to stop the colonies of the United States. We read from the Jesuits by David Mitchell, page 186. It says, clutching at straws, the Jesuit General Ricci had been heartened when King George III's brother, the Duke of Gloucester, lunched with him and hinted at English support. The Jesuit order, having been banished from so many other nations in Europe, they found they were given all they needed to survive and prosper from King George III. This wicked king established the English branch of the Knights of Malta in 1782. In 1795, Stonyhurst, one of England's most beautiful landed estates, was donated to the Jesuit order by an English lord by the name of Mr. Weld. And it would be through King George, through the court of King George III, that the foreign policy of England would be run. The Jesuits would take control of England, and they would use England's military to destroy and to defeat the American colonies and to fiercely persecute the Protestants of the United States. So we see how God stepped in the latter half of the 1700s. You see, the United States of America, the colonies at that time, the 13 colonies, they could war with England, as we saw in the American Revolution. But had these other nations of Europe, these other Catholic countries, if they had been in good standing with the Jesuit order, Catholic Spain, Catholic France, Catholic Portugal, Catholic Italy, Catholic Malta, and many other countries from South America and the Far East, if all of these Catholic countries had been in support of the Jesuit order in the 1770s, think of what would have come against the 13 colonies in 1776. It would have taken an absolute miracle of heaven to deliver the Protestant colonies of America in a war that would have involved all of these Jesuit Catholic strongholds in Europe. So we see how God's hand guided, and how the expulsion of the Jesuit order from all these Catholic countries made it possible for the United States, for the colonies, to rise, as they only had to face England in the American Revolution. A fascinating statement I read recently from J.T. Headley's book called The Chaplains and Clergy of the Revolution, pages 283 and 284. This was the kind of spirit that led the American colonies to sign the Declaration of Independence and to proclaim freedom from tyranny of Jesuit-controlled England. When the Declaration, this is John Witherspoon, 1776, from J.T. Headley's book, and I quote, "When the Declaration of Independence was reported and laid before Congress for their adoption and signature, everyone felt that a fearful crisis had come. And when a timid member remarked that the country was not ripe for such a declaration of independence, John Witherspoon replied in a voice that rung through the hall, 'In my judgment, sir, we're not only ripe, we're rotten. He who will not respond to its accents and strain every nerve to carry into effect its provisions is unworthy of the name of free man. Although these gray hairs must descend into the sepulchre, I would infinitely rather they should descend thither by the hand of the executioner than desert at this crisis the sacred cause of my country.'" It was the spirit of men like John Witherspoon and other great Protestant ministers and leaders that paved the way for the rise of the United States of America. We read the account of another man from the book called The Life of George Washington, pages 307 and 308. It says, "One day a Quaker by the name of Potts was strolling up a creek when he heard in a secluded spot the solemn voice of someone apparently engaged in prayer. Going forward quietly, he saw George Washington's horse tied to a small tree, and a little farther on in a thicket, the chief himself on his knees with tears streaming down his cheeks, beseeching heaven for his country and his army. Before God alone, that strong heart gave way and poured forth the full tide of its griefs and anxieties. Though the heavens grew dark around him, and disaster after disaster wrecked his brightest hopes, and despair settled down on officers and men, he showed the same unalterable presence, moved the same tower of strength. To his God he could safely go with his troubles, and on that arm securely lean. How sublime does he appear! How good and holy the cause he was engaged in seems, as he thus carries it to the throne of a just God, feeling that it has his sanction and can claim his protection." It was the prayers of the Protestant colonists of America that brought about a chain of circumstances that would see the Jesuit order expelled from Catholic France and Spain, Portugal, Italy, and many, many other countries. This made it possible through the American Revolution for the American colonists to be helped and aided by the great Catholic general of France by the name of Lafayette. It made it possible for the colonists to be aided by Spanish soldiers and others who came to their aid during the American Revolution. Without God's special intervention on behalf of America, in these acts of the 1750s and 60s, America probably would never have been a free country, because she would have been destroyed in her infancy by the united Jesuit-controlled Catholic-powered countries of Europe. So we see the rise of the United States of America, the defeat of Jesuit-controlled England, but this story is not over yet. Because you see, as the colonies united, as England was forced to leave the American soil, the Jesuits were enraged. But they had some other business to take care of. And at this time they were raising up a man on the island of Corsica, a man by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte, as history would record for us, he became the tool of the Jesuit order to bring payback to the various countries that had expelled the Jesuit order. It was Napoleon that defeated the Portuguese. It was Napoleon that defeated Spain. It was Napoleon that defeated the island of Malta. And it was Napoleon, the tool of the Jesuits, that went into Rome in 1798 and gave payback to the Pope when the Pope was taken into captivity in that year. And so we see how the Jesuits used Napoleon Bonaparte to pay back these European Catholic countries that had suppressed her in the mid to latter part of the 1700s. You say, but Bill, what about Catholic France? Wasn't Napoleon a French general and leader? Yes, he was. But history records for us two fatal mistakes that Napoleon made. And in both cases, it cost the lives of nearly 250,000 of the very cream of the French soldiery. His first mistake was trying to defeat Russia in the dead of winter. And as Napoleon's soldiers were either starving or being frozen to death in the awful snows of the Russian winter, history records for us the general of the French armies on a sleigh riding away back to his homeland, deserting those many thousands of France's best soldiers. And then we find Napoleon's other mistake at Waterloo. In his battle with the English, in which Napoleon made a strategic error. On the battlefield where Stonewall Jackson would go many years later, and it was obvious to Stonewall Jackson, a great general of the Southern Confederate forces during the Civil War, that Napoleon had made a fatal mistake in the battle at Waterloo, thus losing thousands and thousands of the French's best soldiers at the hands of the English. 1798 was payback for the Pope, for the Catholic Church, and it would take another 16 years, but finally in the Council of Vienna, after the Napoleonic Wars were over, and the Jesuits had their booty and their victory, then at the Council of Vienna, the Pope Pius VII, I believe, would restore the Jesuit order in all their power, as well as all the other Catholic governments of Europe would follow suit. So when the papacy received their deadly wound in 1798, it was payback. Payback for the Catholic Church and the Pope for suppressing the Jesuit order in 1773. I thank God as we conclude this tape that He allowed all those events to bring about a circumstance whereby, in His providential workings, the colonists of the United States, who would create the finest document ever made by an organized government in the United States Constitution, God opened a door whereby all those things could happen, and so that America could enjoy the blessing